Howdy, and welcome to the Petrus Development Show, where we discuss fundraising in the religious sector and how generosity and giving impacts both the organization and the donor. From campus ministries to high schools, from universities and faith-based nonprofits to Catholic parishes, we bring you stories, insights, and best practices that will inspire, educate, and inform you to go out and raise more money for your ministry and the kingdom. God bless, and thank you for joining us today. Well, howdy, and welcome to episode 130 of the Petrus Development Show. I'm so excited to introduce you to RJ Caswell today. RJ and I met on LinkedIn, and I loved my chat with him. RJ is a leadership coach and organizational consultant, and he has a long career history in nonprofits and ministry. He's a wealth of knowledge, and I can't wait to share his insight with you. On that note, I very much hope you'll enjoy my conversation with RJ as much as I did, and as always, be sure to stick around for my 3 takeaways. Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Petrus Development Show. I'm thrilled that you're with us here today. Today, I have a special guest, RJ Caswell. RJ is a leadership coach and a leadership and organizational consultant. He lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, and you will hear his Charlotte, North Carolina accent whenever he's talking on the mic, which is nice and silky smooth. I love it. We're going to talk about fundraising, talk about leadership, talk about all the things that RJ has done in his life and his career, and I'm excited. So, RJ, thanks so much for being here on the call today.
It's great. It's a privilege. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So, we usually start by telling us a little bit about your background. So, tell us about your background. How did you come to be in the position you are in life and in your career today?
Wow, such an easy question to start with, right? I've always been in nonprofit work, although very different sectors. I spent the first, probably 8-10 years in private schools, independent schools, a couple different schools. My background is actually counseling. My graduate degree is in counseling. And so used that in 2 different faith-based schools early on. Was married, graduate school. Thankful for my wife to teach and put me through graduate school. And then I was going to use my counseling degree for my entire career, right? That was my thought at the time. And do it in schools, loved adolescence, loved the energy, vibrancy of schools, and did that for about 4 years in Tennessee. And then that brought us actually to Charlotte, where I've been since 2004, working at a different school. As our journey as a family, so actually, right, my family intersects my profession. We started our family in 2004, and that was through adoption. And so now we have 4 kids. They're actually all teenagers, but we adopted all 4 of our kids really between 2004 and 2007, 8. And it was through then, again, I was a counselor at the school, but I was also doing some private practice on the side to earn extra money. Schools aren't always a lucrative profession. It's a nonprofit profession, but it was not necessarily lucrative. And I was doing counseling therapy on the side and ended up getting really entrenched in the adoption community. And so actually left schools. I thought I was going to be in school work, school-based nonprofit work my entire career, but left that in 07, 08 and started my own nonprofit organization focused on adoption counseling and education. So really thought that was going to be it. Worked with a lot of adoptive families, Christian adoption agencies, faith-based adoption agencies, doing training on attachment trauma, working with families interested in adoption, working with teenagers who were adopted, walking through grief, crisis, you name it. And of course, had my family as well. That was an adoptive family. Work with couples with infertility. And again, that really experience, if anybody started a nonprofit, you can identify, but I've really started this on my own. Yeah. I remember Googling how to write bylaws, Googling how to fill out 501c3 application. Mm-hmm. I advise everybody now, and I've been fortunate to help other folks probably start 7 to 10 nonprofits over the last 15, 20 years. I always say, raise $2,500 and pay an attorney to do all your paperwork. So that's just a side note, nothing about fundraising, nothing about anything else, but save yourself a lot of time and effort and get somebody to do that paperwork for you, but was doing everything. And so that was really my taste of, I would say, direct fundraising. Mm-hmm. Really schools are large and they have their own departments. And I would still say everybody in nonprofit work is a fundraiser. You may or may not have a title, but I think it was more pronounced when I was running my own organization. So I was doing the fundraising, I was doing the counseling, I was doing the marketing, I was doing the business, which I shouldn't have done, the business, the accounting, right? You name it, I was doing that and really thought that was going to be the path for my career, right? And that only lasted a year and a half, which is
Wow.
not normal for a nonprofit, right? A founder,
Hmm.
um, and actually got asked to come on staff at my church that my family had been attending for the last couple of years. And so in 2009, ended up joining the church as an outreach and missions director, ended up being pastor, but involved in missions and outreach.
Hmm.
It was weird, right, to start something and close it a year and a half
Yeah.
later. My wife will remind me that the church job came with benefits.
Okay.
And, and
And an
we had
accountant, right?
right, all of that help support. We had 4 young kids, and benefits were hard to come by for insurance and those sorts of things when you're just trying to make things work month to month. So
Hmm.
didn't know it at the time. Didn't set out to work at a church, but it was a gift, and so did that role for 2 years. And I think that's really where I found my sweet spot, which was really on strategy, on vision, helping really see the future for an area and taking an organization somewhere different. And got to do that, had a blank slate, had a phenomenal mentor who was my boss, really gave me free reign to create, mess up, build bridges, build partnerships. So was able to travel to China, to Ethiopia, develop some really unbelievable partnerships through that. And really, right there is where, to me, I found I love collaboration, I love partnerships, and you can, if done well, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes trust. You can do more together than by yourself.
No, that's well said.
It's messy.
Yeah, as a founder or really any type, in leadership and ministry in particular, it seems like, you're always short staffed. There's always, a need to do more work and you think, well, we can't bring anybody else on to do it, so I'm just going to pile it on and do it myself. And it really is about finding a team and finding partners that can help you out and allow you to do what you're really good at and what you're called to, and find other people that can support in that work as well.
Absolutely. It was actually then, I mean, when I came on staff at the church, I'd never worked at a church, never thought I was going to work at a church, and never done the job they gave me. And so I was like, I'm on an island. Had a great boss. But I started asking around in Charlotte, going, who else is doing this job that I can call? And somebody introduced me to somebody who's become one of my closest friends now. We've known each other for 15 years, but at another church who had the same job. And I literally cold called him up and said, somebody gave me your name. Can we go to coffee?
That's awesome.
And he said yes. Yeah, he said yes. And we ended up doing lunch and realized we're from the same hometown, similar backgrounds. He had been doing the job at the church for about, at that time, 6, 7 years, so a little further down the road from me. Thankfully, he let me pepper him with questions, and that ended up turning to a lifelong friendship with a colleague, and actually helped us partner our churches a couple years later with other churches and start a whole nother organization that brought churches together in Charlotte
Wow.
to pray for each other, know each other, not be isolated. And so it was a really amazing experience to see how God can use relationships, partnerships, collaboration, if we can kind of open our hands a little bit through
Hmm.
that.
Totally.
So did that job only 2 years, and then the executive pastor for large churches, kind of the person who runs the organization, left, and I was asked to be an executive pastor again. No training for that. I don't know if there is training for that. Definitely not in college. I didn't go to seminary, but not even in seminaries do you train to be kind of an executive at a church. So stepped into that overnight. Was responsible for 50 plus staff, had 12 direct reports. Every area of the church reported up to me, from finance, facilities, HR, and finance, to all the ministry areas, all of our pastoral staff as well. Really learned literally by jumping into the fire that first year.
And did you do something similar? Did you reach out to other pastors or build a network to pepper them with questions or to build that community to help yourself grow?
Very quickly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
one was actually my mentor, who was the executive pastor who left. We're still friends. He still texts me. I still ask him advice. And so even though he moved to Tennessee to work at a different church, I was calling him every month. And then quickly got connected to, at the time, our denomination had a group that was for executive pastors. So
Mm,
quickly got into that
nice.
group, quickly got into Leadership Network. It's kind of a large church-based leadership group, and they had some programs for executive pastors. So tried to jump into community and professional development to see, okay, how do you do this, and how do you do it well?
That's awesome.
And had a blast. We were really growing, and so I got to do a lot of, I say, fun things. I mean, we had different locations in the city of Charlotte, so got to look at how you do real estate, how you do lease agreements, how do you do leadership development, how do you move people around in an organization to get them in a better spot, how you exit people. I mean, it was doing it all. And so right, some rough times, but was really honestly blessed with a supportive team. My leadership team during that season, I would have put up against anybody else's leadership team. Just working together, had appropriate pushback, but at the end of the day, we trusted each other and had a blast. And so ended up being executive pastor for a little over 10 years. And during that season, we had succession planning implementation. I ended up writing a lot about that on LinkedIn because I've lived it and see the importance, but rarely see it done in nonprofits and churches. It's usually an afterthought, and I think that becomes a really big challenge for organizations to move forward. And for us, in our context, when our senior pastor retired, he'd been there 42 years.
Wow.
And the research I did, really, anybody who's led for, I think it was 15 years or more, it's just unique challenges because so much of culture is built around that senior leader, whether you
Yeah.
want it to or not, whether it's good or bad, whether that senior leader even recognizes it or not. It's just who they are, and how they live their life and how they lead becomes a fabric of an organization.
Well, especially after 42 years, they are the church. For probably 90% of the people coming to there for church have never had another pastor, right? He is the
Never.
pastor, and then he's gone, and it's like, wait, who is our church? Who is leading this? And challenge for you, but I'm sure some opportunity there as well,
It was a challenge, but I'll give him credit. He's the one who actually came to me and said, "We need to start talking about my
right?
transition." He didn't love the word retirement. He said transition, um, but it was fun. But I'll give him credit. He recognized this was going to be honestly hard for
Yeah.
him, even though it was going to be time in the next couple of years, but really hard for the church for all those reasons. And so we did a lot of work, took a couple of years doing research, putting together some teams and committees to figure out how to do that well, how to walk through that, all those pieces, elders involved.
So you spent a couple of years planning for the transition, huh?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
it was a couple years.
Okay, that's pretty rare as well.
Yes, and I would still say it takes that long, especially for somebody if the succession is going to be retirement of a longstanding leader, whether it's again nonprofit, I would even say for profit or church. It takes a while because it surfaces emotions and tensions and things you never thought were going to come up that were important either to that leader or to the organization. I think it surfaced so many sacred cows, or elephants in the room, whatever words you want to
Yeah.
use.
Right.
People say, "Oh, that can change," and then you start changing, and they really didn't mean it, or they forgot about this one thing that was
Mhm.
unsaid. And so,
Mhm.
I really do think it takes a couple years to really walk through those pieces and try to surface as much as you can. And I think we did a good job, and we still didn't surface all of what was to come,
Yeah.
which ended up being a church merger. So I did succession planning and implementation for a couple years, and then ended up leading a merger of two churches as part of that plan for 4 years.
Wow.
And so, merging any organization's hard, but you add people's faith community
Mhm.
and where they worship to the equation. It interesting, and that was hard because we were changing culture. Everybody's culture
Yeah.
was changing. Both former churches, new leader for one church, the staff was merged together, our elders were merged together, our board, and we had new mission, vision, values that we tried to say were now common, but one church had a 45-year history, one church had a 10-year
Mm.
history, and
Yeah.
everybody brings history. And so we can talk positive and future, which I'm prone to do. I'm a futurist, I'm a strategist. So for me, it was easy to go, yeah, the past was great, good, but we're going
Right.
forward. Um, but I learned so much about grief in transition for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and how you need to take a lot of time. And we probably did not take enough time on how to approach grief for staff.
Well, it's interesting because, right, there's 5 stages of grief, right? And I'm sure you could tell me what they all are, right? But one of the ones that comes out a lot of times is anger. And
Yep,
you don't realize that people are, when they're angry about a transition, a lot of that anger is just born out of sadness and grief about a loss.
that's exactly right.
That's probably the hardest thing because that anger really stings and it makes you, in some cases dig in and say, no, we're doing this. I don't care, what arrows are coming at me as the leader. And then, the other side is like, all right, well, maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I'm not making the right decision and we need to, undo some of this. Either way, right, has pros and cons to it, but it's hard because you take that anger personally as the leader or as the leadership team when in reality it's helping people process their grief is what is going to help move through that transition the best.
I would agree. We needed you at the time to help us walk through that. But
Yeah.
because I do think it right, so much is lost. And what I also found is so many people, right? Life is all about change, whether it's jobs, family,
Hmm.
kids, moving cities, whatever it is. And I think so many people, and I would say I'm in this camp too, even though I was working for the church and a member of the church, they don't want the church to change. They want it to be the constant for them.
Hmm.
And so any change is perceived as threat in their faith tradition, in that church, synagogue, whatever it might be. They really, I think, have an expectation for that to be a constant place for them, an
Right.
anchor. And in
Right.
many ways, it still is and can be, but going through periods of change and transition, I think, magnify what you just shared,
Yeah.
that loss and sadness.
Yeah. Are you a nonprofit struggling to navigate the world of digital marketing and finding it difficult to strike a balance between high costs and the expertise needed to effectively promote your cause? Well, if so, listen up. I want to introduce you to On Fire Media. On Fire Media understands the unique challenges that nonprofits face, often paying agencies whose values don't align with theirs, and as a result, suffering from high cost or low quality marketing. On Fire Media gives you an entire team of digital marketing professionals passionate about serving other Catholics who do great work. They offer a wide range of affordable digital marketing services, including branding, websites, email marketing, social media, and PPC advertising. They'll work closely with you to develop custom-tailored strategies that align with your values and your budget. Their passion ensures your investment is well worth it, empowering you to achieve your goals without compromise. So are you ready to take your digital marketing to the next level? If so, visit CatholicWebsite.com today to get in touch with On Fire Media or to view their portfolio. Again, that's CatholicWebsite.com. So you went through a merger, and then what? Was that your time to
That was
exit
that was my time
the
to
role?
exit.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, and I the church was wonderful. I actually had shared that when we started doing succession planning, that I thought I would help get them through succession and transition. What ended up being merger, and my time would probably be done. They asked me to stay, asked me to walk through that, and I did. And so I knew on the other side of that, it was a new leadership team. We got that in
Yeah.
place. I felt like there was stability for this new church, and it was my time to go. Okay, I felt pretty comfortable that God had said, "You've done what I've asked you to do, and let's just move on." And so, honestly, that was fall of 2021, time of discovery. I had some time. The church blessed me and was looking at how do I use who I am in this next season, ended up getting connected with the folks at Infinite Giving as a startup, helping nonprofits think about sustainability, which I love. So even though I worked at a church for 12 years, I helped start probably 12 different ministries in the city, either startup, funding, advising, consulting, or on the
Mhm.
board. I sit on 3 boards now. So I'm really passionate about that process and about sustainability for nonprofits. And when this is a space that needs some disruption and needs services to medium sized
Mhm.
nonprofits.
Mhm.
And so did that for a year. Revenue probably wasn't there to sustain positions and moving forward. The economy didn't help. Some headwinds with helping nonprofits consider investing in a
Mhm.
recession.
Mhm. Yeah.
But learned a lot. Was honestly, that was my kind of foray into LinkedIn and writing, things I've never done before, and really felt like I added value, and it helped me process a career through writing.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so found a love, connected with you through LinkedIn, and
Mhm.
so many other amazing leaders across the country. And so highly value this past year. I think that's kind of setting me up for what's to come.
That's awesome. I appreciate you sharing your story and your journey. And so I'd love to go back and dive into a couple of those pieces because I think they're pretty fascinating. One, just the adoption aspect, right? Like that's one of the ways that kind of we found common ground in some
Hmm.
of our LinkedIn connections is your kids are adopted. I have one that's adopted, and sharing about the positives, the challenges of that has been just really fruitful and helpful. But what was that experience like? Starting a firm specifically to help families to be able to adopt.
Sure. I mean, it was right. It was our experience as a family. We have 4 kids. They're all teenagers now. All were adopted. We knew growing up in the South, our family looked really different visually. My 2 older children are both Guatemalan, Latino. My twins, who are in ninth grade now, are from Ghana, so they're Ghanaian. And so, as a family, the reality is, when we went to Trader Joe's or the grocery store or Target, it was 2 white parents, 2 Latino children, and 2 black children. And so when they were babies and small, right, that there was an experience there for all of us on how to walk through that. With my counseling background and heart for serving people, and I ended up just getting a lot of questions, and my wife did as well, about adoption in general. And then we'd start getting referrals to go, hey, can you talk to this family? They're really struggling. Or we know somebody who adopted a much older child, and that child's struggling. Can you step in? So I started researching, like, what's out there to support
Yeah.
families,
Yeah.
and realized at that time, this was again in that kind of '06, '07, '08 period, there was not a lot. And so talked to a couple other friends in the counseling world, and encouraged me to go, there's space for this. Let's go support families.
When we started our adoption journey, it was a introduction to a world, and we got an education and adoption that I didn't know, right?
Right.
And we learned, all the different paths to adoption, right? Foster to adopt, international, domestic. There's a number of different ways, and then one of the things that we learned about specifically with domestic adoption is the idea of open adoption, and that was something that
Yep.
we never knew anything about, and we're really kind of terrified. First learning about it,
Hmm.
terrified, and the agency that we ended up working with had been around for 45 years at the time and had been one of the pioneers of open adoption. And they gave us books, they gave us resources, and we read it. We dove in, and it was
Yeah.
so helpful. And now, Nora's 8, and we've been to Arkansas 7 times to visit her family. They send birthday presents. We've met her birth father, who lives in New York.
Mm.
It's been a wild ride, but that experience, I don't know that we would have been open to it without some of those resources that you're talking about, and having received that education and that learning about how this could be beneficial if we were open to it.
I mean, I think you make a great point. I mean, when we were going through it as well, I mean, we wanted to be parents, and that was our path.
Yeah.
And we started down the path of international because honestly, at that time, this would have been '02, '03 for us, my wife and I, as we started processing, praying, and talking about family and how that was going to happen. The process is really
Mhm.
long. So even though we brought our oldest home in '04, that really started probably in '02. Um, like you, what we heard about open domestic was fearful as
Mhm.
well, which is so unfortunate because it's not typically the
Hmm.
case. And in fact, as I jumped into the clinical side of it years later, you realize that actually the best outcomes for families and children for domestic is open
Agreed.
adoption.
Yep. Correct.
And so we actually didn't get really good wisdom and counsel, and I'm thankful for my kids. So I
Hmm.
mean, it's all worked out, and love my family. But at that critical point, to what you were saying is there wasn't many resources for us to grasp
Hmm.
onto. We ended up meeting with an attorney, and that's the one who was giving us advice. And nothing against attorneys, but they didn't know the world of
Right.
attachment
Right.
and
Yeah.
trauma and
They know the
research.
laws and the legalities behind it, yeah, and your background as a counselor, right, your active, work in counseling others has only
Mm.
helped you sort of recognize this is how we can be the best parents to our kids, and this is how we can help other families, which I think is just really powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, that's it was right. I mean, I had a good job, and I remember going to the head of school and saying, I'm not coming back the next year. And he said, "What you're going to do? What are you doing?" And I shared, and he just couldn't
Right,
understand it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and honestly, probably I couldn't fully understand it, but knew there was enough there to go. There's a big gap in serving families in this way, and why not me?
yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, RJ. I know that, everybody's story is personal, and I appreciate you sharing it with me and with our audience. We'll get back to the interview in just a second, but first, here's a quick message. So recently I had an issue with a plumbing leak. I knew that I could figure it out on my own, but after spending an entire day, including 3 trips to the hardware store and $40 in parts, it was still leaking. Finally, I broke down and asked someone at the store who told me about a $5 kit with all the pieces that I needed. I got home and had the issue fixed in 10 minutes. What a pain, but also what a lesson learned. If I had just asked somebody who knew what they were doing, the cost of paying for their expertise would have more than made up for the time and money I wasted experimenting with my own fixes. The same principle is true in fundraising. The Petrus Annual Manual provides your ministry with access to the experience and knowledge of current best practices in fundraising so you can skip the trial and error. The plan and guidance will accelerate the entire process and allow you to immediately implement fundraising activities that actually work to build a strong foundation for your fundraising efforts. Where would your organization be today if you had invested in your development program 5 years ago? What ministry and outreach will you be leaving on the table 5 years from now if you don't invest in your fundraising today? To learn more about the Petrus Annual Manual, visit our website at petrusdevelopment.com/annual manual. I'd love to now shift to another part of the story that you're talking about, and this is the idea of leadership. And then I think that we could probably even dial in even closer into this idea of succession. Now you're a leadership coach. You work with people professionally. You work with people as volunteers, as board members. What are some of the most critical components of leadership? And it could be particular to the nonprofit or the ministry space or not, that you see leaders either actively struggling with or looking for solutions to, that you've been able to help with.
Sure, and I think, probably it's right. My experience
Hmm.
is how I ended up getting shaped into this. I remember, I think when I shared, I stepped into this role, and all of a sudden, overnight, I had 12 direct
Yeah.
reports and responsible for 50 people. What in the world? I didn't have a category for
Hmm.
that, and so I think a lot of my coaching ends up being with other leaders who step into that and don't know where to turn. And I think quickly for leaders, and I think this is for new leaders, and I think this is for leaders who've been leading for 40 years, is isolation and loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's not something we talk about much. I don't see it written about much, probably because it doesn't, sound strong. I think a majority of leaders, and I was one of them, deal with isolation and loneliness. Who can I trust?
Hmm.
Have I built a place that I can trust? Can I trust my board? Can I trust my leadership team? Can I trust, if you're in a nonprofit, right? You have a lot of constituencies,
Hmm.
especially in a church, members, staff, boards, and you shrink your world really quickly and try. I think that's why I'm so passionate about coaching, is have a safe place to process, reflect, look in the mirror, get encouragement, and realize you're not crazy. You can do this. So I think when I think of coaching in organizations, I think so many of it revolves around loneliness, isolation, and trust.
Yeah, and I would agree with that 100%. There everybody knows the phrase "it's lonely at the top," right? And it's not because it's because it's true, right? And to kind of take this to, a lot of our audience is fundraisers. So I think the same issues apply to fundraising. They struggle with that loneliness, that isolation, and that trust as well, um, because in many ways they're kind of put into a position where they haven't been trained, but they love the organization.
Yeah.
We think you can fundraise, so come be our fundraiser. They're not trained, and then nobody else in the organization really knows like how to help and how to support them, and so they're kind of on an island. You figure out our fundraising, and we need this much money. Go find it. It appears to be very clear from a fundraising standpoint. Are you successful or are you not successful? Did you raise the amount of money that we need or did you not? And if you didn't, well, guess what? People are going to lose their jobs. And that's a really stressful and creates a lot of anxiety and isolation. And I see some of the things that I try to do both personally and then professionally through Petrus is just try to build community. Like just try to be there and support people and say there is a period where you're going to have to learn how to do this. And that means that there's not going to be as much money that's coming in during this period, but you're going to be learning and growing and building those relationships for down the road. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater too quickly, right? Because maybe you're perfect for this position and you just have to give it time to grow. And I'm sure it's the same, to your experience, probably early on when you were in that executive pastor role, there were probably many times that you're thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know that I'm the right person. They made a huge mistake.
Oh,
And, but you were able to build community and stick with it versus being alone and saying, I don't know what I'm doing. Nobody really else can tell me that I know what I'm doing. I guess I must be the wrong person. I'm out.
I think you hit on it. It's finding community in all those roles. 'Cause I think when I think of fundraisers, especially this past year, I've met so many in my work with Infinite Giving, and then now, and actually was meeting with one yesterday, who very
Hmm.
successful, right, with metrics, right. But then he said, "New fiscal year starts next week."
Right. What have you done for me today? That.
What if and so it's literally he was trying to ramp himself up because it was a successful year and go, now it's a clean slate. We're back at 0.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of challenges within that, especially for organizations that really aren't set up as a team, right? Every team member has a different function. Fundraising should be one of those functions, but I think typically it's approached as silos, and fundraisers go get us our money, program people go use the money,
Hmm.
and you have a executive director trying to figure out how to talk to both of those as separate entities instead of a really unified organization. I know that's tough, so it's easy to say build an organization as a team. Doing it's different, but I do think fundraisers are on that front lines, and that isolation, loneliness. Am I supported? Am I not supported?
Hmm.
I didn't get the big gift, so am I out of job? Am I not out of job? So trust,
Hmm.
that same idea of do I trust my leader
Hmm.
or not? And if you burned once, right, it's even harder to trust.
You said earlier, everybody in a nonprofit is a fundraiser, whether they have the title or not.
Yeah.
Were there things that you did during your time in leadership that you found to be particularly helpful in helping people that were not the frontline fundraisers understand that and be able to support the fundraising?
I think it comes right in how that senior leader spends his time or her
Mhm.
time, what they're doing with it. Are they also meeting with people? Are they meeting with the team regularly? Are they sharing in team meetings that we're doing this together? And so when a programmatic type person is interacting with a client or customer, is it at a level that the volunteer actually sees that interaction? So you have that volunteer there and they're watching a staff person
Mhm.
in real time. So I'm a full believer in so much of leadership is action oriented behaviors. And if we're leaving those behaviors out, if we're living them, people see that. And that's fundraising
Mhm.
because that volunteer is going to go, wow, that was powerful.
Mhm.
And so that programmatic person has no clue they're helping fund the organization. But if they're taking the steps of being a good leader, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a university or a high school, right, and somebody's an alum of a program, right, and they are approached, 20 years after graduation and asked for a gift. Well, part of what they're going to use to form their decision about whether they want to make that gift or not is based on the experience they had in their classroom 20 years ago, right? The teachers, they
Yep.
cared for me. The administration, they gave me the support that I needed. My counselor, listened to me when I was struggling. Like those are the times that really matter in that scenario with that alum. Whether they're going to give, the development officer, the fundraiser, is there to help cultivate the relationship now and help them see the impact, which is important. But it all starts with that program 20 years before, however
Uh,
long ago. It's the same thing in church, right? People are going to make their decisions about how generous they want to be based on their experience on Sundays, based on their experience and, in the programs on Wednesday nights and everything else. And then when
yep.
the fundraiser approaches them, that's all going to factor into it. So it's so important that the programming be done well, but then also it's so helpful if those programmers recognize what I'm doing right now is feeding them today what they need, but I'm also setting them up for future growth and future generosity that may come back to our institution, but certainly may go to other institutions as well.
I think that's right. I mean, I think of that fundraiser, major gifts officer, who's out there cultivating. They're going to be fighting a strong headwind if you have dysfunction
Right.
on
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
actual, program side or leadership or even CEO, executive director side. If you have somebody who's pushing change or abrasive or
Hmm.
doesn't understand emotional intelligence and walking through sensitive places, you're making the actual job of the major gifts officer, advancement officer, so much more difficult in cultivating that relationship because now they're actually putting out fires
Hmm.
instead of sharing vision or sharing opportunity for funding.
Yeah, I think that's all great points. I want to spend the next probably 4 or 5 minutes talking about succession planning. So you said that, in your work with taking on your role as pastor, right, you went through this
Mhm.
succession planning process. What were some of the best things that you guys did? And what were some of the things that when you're working with somebody now that's going through a transition or preparing for transition, you say, these are the most important elements to consider and to plan for as part of that?
So I think when we started going through it, one, I think it really is awareness of a board and a leader to go through it. I think I had this conversation yesterday that so many boards don't want to talk about it,
Hmm.
especially if it's their CEO or their executive director. They're fearful. They're also volunteers. There's only so much capacity. They're not experts, but I think they're fearful of bringing it up because they think the CEO is going to think they're getting pushed out.
Mm.
The CEO doesn't want to talk about it because it brings up identity issues and what's next, and maybe they'll just push me out quicker. So I
Mhm.
think again, I use the word a lot. Trust has to be a foundation of good succession planning. And I think the other thing I learned is succession planning really needs to be part of the fabric of the organization and not just from that top leader position. It needs to be, I need to be looking at who am I developing behind me. So maybe I move to a different place in the organization or leave the organization that there's an opportunity for growth. Not that you can't do outside hires, but that you're really looking at the entire organization from a succession planning model,
Mm.
that we're always looking at what's next, growth, opportunities. That's all part of succession to me. And I think that was a realization as we were going through it because we used a really good consultant who actually didn't just meet with the board and senior pastor, he met with leaders throughout the organization. And it really helped me understand, actually, I had somebody who was ready to go work at another church,
Mhm.
and we were able to embrace that and celebrate that and encourage that and not see that as loss.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super helpful, and that's something that hadn't really thought about in terms of succession. But you're right that creating that culture. I waited tables for a couple of years back in college and around college, and it was the restaurant that I was at had probably about 40 locations, but it was part of a bigger network of other restaurants, and some that level, some really high end level. But they made a point of no matter where you started at the organization, there was opportunities for you to move up in responsibility and then also in other ways, right, responsibility and
Right.
seniority and pay and everything else. And there were, I remember one of our kitchen managers started 20 years before as a busboy at one of the locations, and it didn't dawn on me until you just said that, but it was this culture of you can, wherever you start, like you can learn, you have to bloom where you're planted, right? That's the first thing, right? Do
Hmm.
be successful where you are now. But if you do that, there are opportunities for you to move up, and then there are opportunities for you to, if somebody leaves, we're going to celebrate that, and we're going to plan. We're already going to have a plan in place for how to fill that need, because we have a stable of people that we've been cultivating and nurturing all along.
Right. So I think succession right is typically looked at as that senior leader, and that's vitally important, especially in
Mhm.
probably the next 5 to 7 years in nonprofits. We look at boomers and age. We're going to have a lot of succession, whether they're planned for or not. My hope is that boards and leaders can kind of put fear aside and start having conversations about it, because I think it's just
Yeah.
going to be a healthier process than fear, and fear drives so much.
Just one more question on that. Do you, just from a tactical standpoint, do you think, because I think you're right? Like the questions of, do we start talking about succession, can be perceived negatively by either side, right?
Yeah.
So, but from your experience, do you think that it usually comes better as that conversation starting from the executive director that might conceivably be looking at a move, a transition, or do you think it's better from that board, volunteer, other staff position to say, we're not saying you're moving on, but we want to start planning for it in the case that it does. Just tactically, where do you see that as being kind of the better place to start, or is there a better place?
Gosh, phenomenal question. I went back and forth as you were talking on how to answer that. I would probably still answer at the end of the day, the board has to be responsible for the organization, because that's how nonprofits are set up.
Mm, okay.
So I would love to see more boards engaging their leaders out of a place of relationship and trust about that conversation than the other way, because that's where ownership will end up happening.
Hmm.
And so I would still say at the end of the day, I would love to see more board chairs engaging that conversation. Even if it's a plan for that leader's only been there 3 years and you're just looking at succession down the road, even if it's a not a detailed plan, but a conversation that leads to a plan. We're all going to need succession, whether it's you're in the role for a year or 42.
Right.
And I think what happens is a void happens, knowledge goes out the window. You have all the other pieces creep in to affect culture. And not that a plan's going to solve all that, but at least there's some confidence to walk through it.
One of the best things that I did personally this last year was I read a book called Clockwork by Mike Michalowicz, which is a great business book. He's got a whole line of really powerful business books, but this was about not necessarily succession planning, but how do you allow your institution, organization, business, whatever it is, exist and operate at the highest level without being so reliant on one person, which is typically
Yeah.
the founder or the executive director, which, to your point, it's really hard to transition when that's the culture. He's got a lot of great information and insights in that. But one of the ways that you kind of pressure test this idea of how reliant is everybody on the founder or the person in charge is they take a sabbatical, take a month off, plan for it, be gone,
Mhm.
and be out of. The key is to plan for it and then do it and then
Yep.
triage afterwards. I did that this last year. I took the month of August off, and it was incredible. It was no relaxation for me. I've got 4 kids. We potty trained one, and I changed, more diapers than I can shake a fist at. But it was great to build trust with the team, right? I
Mhm.
trusted them in a new way to be able to handle things while I was gone. They trusted me to be able to get out of the way when they have an idea or they have something initiative they want to work towards. And that was a really, powerful experience for me. And then afterwards, I was talking to one of my buddies, and he says he goes to a church out in West Texas, and he said they're part of a network. And he says we do the same thing with our pastors. One, it's to rest, right?
Right.
But I think that, to your point, Andrew, what you're trying to get out of it, I think that it's to empower the staff as much. And
Mhm.
I just thought it's more common than I thought. I just didn't realize it. But I thought that was just a really powerful experience for me. And, who knows what the future holds for me at Petrus. And, I plan to be here for a long, long time. But right,
Right.
if I'm hit by a bus tomorrow, like, I want the company and the good work that we're doing to continue, and being able to empower the team to do that is important.
Well, I think your point is right. I mean, something like a sabbatical, whether you call it that or not, you're flexing a muscle for the organization that's not normally
Hmm.
flexed. And I think that just ends up being a healthier organization for it.
Well, cool. Well, RJ, this has been fantastic. I have appreciated your insights and your advice on fundraising, on leadership, on transitions, on succession planning. We've covered a lot of different topics, and I certainly do appreciate it.
Well, thanks. It's a blast. I always love it, and it's good to actually have face to face conversation with you instead of through comments on LinkedIn, which is awesome
Yeah.
too. But it's been fun.
Good. Well, what do you say we transition to our lightning round now?
Let's do it.
The lightning round is brought to you by the Petrus Development Annual Manual. The Annual Manual provides a strong fundraising foundation, setting your organization up for long-term success. Each week, you will speak with a development consultant to keep you on track and help you excel. You will also receive access to dozens of how-to guides, samples, and templates to help you execute fundraising activities without having to reinvent the wheel. In addition, a development calendar and a weekly development task email will ensure that you know exactly what to focus on at each point in the year. Visit petrusdevelopment.com/annual manual to learn more. All right, first question of our lightning round. If you could fundraise for any organization or cause at any point in history, what would it be?
It would definitely be cause. You might have asked this on LinkedIn or somebody else did as well. I can't remember where I saw it, but it would be something around vulnerable children. I mean, that's kind of been everything I end up touching, whether my family supports it in Ghana, Guatemala, different places in the world. It would be child advocacy, vulnerable children in some form or fashion.
Huge need out there. Question number 2. If you could get a donor meeting with anyone in the world, living or dead, who would it be with?
Yeah. So you prepped me a little bit for these, and I've been thinking on this for hours, and I still don't have a great answer. I don't know. Isn't that terrible? That I don't know. I would want to pick somebody, honestly, who is in that really upper echelon of wealth, to pick their brain on how they approach wealth. Not so much to try to get a donation out of them, but I think there's so much wrapped into that high net worth on what's your number, and always chasing and trying to get in that mindset. So whether that's, I don't know, Bezos or any of those guys, like what's driving this? Because you're not taking it with you.
Yep.
You can buy another yacht, you can buy another jet. That's fantastic. But we all know, because we read it in the news, you can be gone tomorrow.
Absolutely.
And so what is that view of generosity? So probably not a great answer.
No, it'd be fascinating. Yeah. Question number 3. Is there enough money out there for every organization that's doing good work?
Absolutely.
Why do you say that?
Well, my faith tradition, I believe we have a generous God. God's going to provide everything out there. I think we're the ones who hoard. We're the ones who pull back, me included. Doesn't really, regardless of salary, regardless of those pieces, I think if we all have approached that resources are from God and we're here to be dispensers of generosity, I just fully believe all the resources are there.
Question number 4. If you could go back in time and offer yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
Ask more questions, and ask more questions of people who are in your role who've done it before.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you've done that to some extent. So the fact that you want to do it more.
It took a while. Okay. Yeah. It took a while for me to get there, but earlier in my career, I wish I'd have done that much earlier.
Yeah.
I kind of had blinders on until that point.
Seeking advice like that is necessitated by just your situation, right? So you don't think you need to ask the questions until you need to ask questions, but
that's right.
Developing that practice, developing that muscle as early as possible is great. Question number 5. Who are 3 people who have most influenced your professional development?
I'd say by far number 1, and I'll probably go with 2. The first is the executive pastor who hired me at the church, who ended up leaving. I took his role. He's still a mentor. He still texts me. He still reaches out. But early on, when I became an outreach and missions pastor, never done that job before. 2 instances stand out. Early on, I was meeting with him in our weekly one-on-ones and asking him 100 different questions. And finally, he stopped me one day, probably 6 weeks into working for him. He called a timeout in the meeting and said, "RJ, I have no idea how to answer any of these questions. That's why I hired you, and I believe you can figure it out."
Yeah.
And what he was saying is, I'm not the outreach missions pastor. I'm the executive pastor. And I'm here to support you, but I don't know which partner to take. I don't know all the pieces. Go learn it, go do it. And so it was just a moment for me to go, oh, he believes in me, and I need to go do this. So that one. And then another time I was meeting with him, and I was complaining about how much I had to do. I was overwhelmed. I was spinning a lot of plates that didn't really seem connected at the time. And again, he stopped me in my tracks, stopped the meeting, and looked at me and smiled, which was really odd, and said, you love this, right? And he put a mirror up to me on how I was wired, and he was right. I realized I love variety. I love building bridges and partnerships. I was overwhelmed and I didn't have good systems, but the message to me was, you're actually doing what you're supposed to do. You're wired for this. You're wired. And so those two moments for him, to me, I still talk about all the time. And so he's there. And I would actually say another one who had an influence is actually a boss who's not my direct boss. I was on a leadership team. I won't name the organization. It was a long time ago. So, but he was the opposite. And I remember sitting in leadership meetings where he would berate people. We'd have 4-hour meetings. I was never his target, but I watched how he navigated other leaders. And it was very domineering, authoritative. And I really thought, is this what leadership is? And it really helped me go, that's not who I want to be if I'm ever leading people.
Yeah. Both of those very powerful. You see the model and then you see the model you don't want to be. So
yeah, and that was it for sure.
Great. Question number 6. What is something interesting about you that people may not know?
Oh boy. I've already, said all my kids came through us through adoption, so we're a very different looking family that we love. What's something people don't know about me? I lived in England, and so for a Southerner living in England, that was an experience.
Yeah.
Not too much fun fact, but love to travel with our family. So really traveling the world opened my eyes to, I don't know how to do everything. My culture's not the culture.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. Question number 7. What is one book that you think everyone should read?
This one's easy for me. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, love it.
Phenomenal book. Read it, I think my senior year in college or maybe the first year out of college. It just had a profound effect on, even when I was in my counseling program, that book probably is one of the best counseling books I read, even though it's not a counseling book. It's one of my favorite leadership books, even though it's not a leadership book. I just think his story and the way he told it is powerful.
That's awesome. Well, RJ, this has been a treat. If people want to get a hold of you or learn more or track you down, where can they find you?
Right now, LinkedIn's the best way. So if you're not on LinkedIn, I encourage you to jump on, connect with me, shoot me a message, comment, and would love to meet anybody who's out there who goes, let's get together.
Great. I can testify. RJ puts out great stuff on LinkedIn, and so definitely follow him. A lot of inspiration and insights. So appreciate you being there and being present, and appreciate you being on this call, taking time for this interview. And I think that got a lot of good insights for our listeners, regardless of kind of where they're at in life or career. And I think that I appreciate you taking the time.
It was a joy. Thanks so much.
Good. And for all those listening, thank you very much for joining me and RJ. If you have any questions, you can hit me up at podcast@petrusdevelopment.com. Otherwise, God bless you, God bless your work, and we'll see you next time. Wow, RJ and I had a fabulous discussion, and I'm glad you're here for my takeaways from our chat. I probably could have come up with a few more takeaways from this one, but I'll give you my top 3. The timing of this podcast episode is awesome. I recently spent a few days in Belton, Texas, facilitating a gathering of campus ministry staff from the Diocese of Austin. We had a great time of reflection about campus ministry, its successes, best practices, and the challenges that campuses face. It's amazing how many of those themes from my gathering came up in my chat with RJ. So that duplication must have meant we're onto something, and I got to put them in my takeaway. So my first takeaway from my discussion with RJ is about collaboration and mentorship. RJ shares how, when he was thrust into roles in which he had very little formal training or prior experience, he prioritized reaching out to other people who were doing similar roles but who had been doing it longer. He asked questions, he shared ideas, and really, he built friendships. And because of the help of these mentors, he was able to do his job effectively. RJ was open to learning from others, and he was not shy about his lack of experience. The recent campus ministry gathering highlighted this need for mentorship and relationship building as well. Often, I come to this podcast talking about the relationships we need to build with donors. Today, however, I'm going to challenge you to build relationships with other professionals who do work that is similar to yours. If you're a campus ministry, reach out to other campus ministers in your area. If you're a nonprofit fundraiser, call up a development professional from another local nonprofit. Your goal in initiating these relationships is to create space. You'll create space to share ideas, ask questions, share challenges, and accept feedback. Use the expertise of others to improve your own work. There is absolutely no shame in reaching out for help or advice. And more often than not, people are happy to share what they know. Think of it in reverse as well. If somebody calls you and seeks your expertise, I want to encourage you to give them some of your time and share your wisdom. You never know what you might learn from them as well. For my second takeaway, I go back to one of the first very wise things that RJ shared. He was describing his experience of starting his own nonprofit, and he said, "Everybody in nonprofit work is a fundraiser. You may or may not have the title." Truer words have never been spoken. This idea of everyone in an organization being a fundraiser speaks to a variety of situations. First, in small to medium organizations and ministries, you may not have a specific staff person for development. The executive director or the pastor or the campus minister may be the driving force behind fundraising, whether they like it or not. There's just no one else to do it. Second, even if you do have a development professional or two on staff, the development office does not work in a silo. Fundraisers can only be effective when they have the support of the entire staff. If the pastoral or programming staff doesn't offer fruitful programs, there's no stories or metrics to share with donors. Or sometimes, potential donors have a better relationship with a pastor than they do with a fundraiser. In that case, the pastor must work with the fundraiser to ask for a major gift. It could be the pastor's presence at a meeting that encourages that donor to give. And incidentally, we discussed this very topic at our gathering the other week, specifically as it applies to the relationship between pastoral and development teams in campus ministry. Too often, there's the inclination to divide the teams based on role. Development staff raises money, pastoral staff spends the money on programs. There's a lack of intentional relationship building, and as a result, both teams suffer when they assume they don't play a larger role in the work of their counterparts. Development staff or no, all staff create the environment, produce the programs, and embrace the vision of the ministry. All of this contributes to the ability to raise money. And finally, I leave you with a takeaway from RJ's reflection on leadership. He shared about the isolation that he sees in many of the leaders he coaches. We commiserated about how it's lonely at the top of an organization because of the constant need to innovate and tackle new things and the lack of people in the organization who know what you're doing. We talked about how development professionals often feel the same isolation for many of the same reasons. They're often thrust into a job for which they don't have specific training. They might just be organized and have a passion for the organization. They're not trained, and other staff don't know how to train or support them. They have to figure things out on their own, and honestly, that's a scary place to be, especially if the need for money is urgent. These fundraisers might think they're incapable of being successful, and as a result, they might be tempted to give up. But RJ reminded us that it's necessary to take a learning period and accept that funds might not come in during this period, and that's okay. It's okay to take time and try to learn new things. And it's okay to take time to reach out to mentors and find a professional networking community. I love how RJ said it. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe you're perfect for the position and you just need time to grow. Thus, I leave you with this takeaway. Take the time for professional development and collaboration. It might reduce immediate funds coming in now, but in the long run, with what you've gained, you're likely to find much more sustained success. That's it for today. Thanks for joining me for this discussion. I sure hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe to this show and our other shows, Holy Donors and Women in Philanthropy. I'll be in Louisville, Kentucky next week for our Raise 23 Catholic Fundraising Conference, and I hope to see some of you there. Thanks, and God bless. I'm so glad that you could join us for this episode of the Petrus Development Show. Do you know anybody whose ministry needs to take their fundraising to the next level? Please pass along this show to them. And if you haven't already, take a minute and do 3 things. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. If you like the show, give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review. And check out our website, petrusdevelopment.com. Your ministry and the kingdom need good people doing great development work, and your donors receive just as much benefit from giving as your organization does from receiving. And as it says in Luke 5, cast your nets out into the deep. Be bold and the Lord will provide. God bless, and we'll see you next time.